Okay, so political parties then, we are continuing with that. Party eras, okay, we talked a little bit about that at the end last time. A party era is basically a period of time, an era in American political history when one party really dominates and really most voters identify with it. We're talking about voter party identification, which party voters identify with. When you have decades where the majority of voters identify with one party rather than the other, you call that a party era. Okay, so that party, their candidates are consistently being elected. You see that even before public opinion polling, you can obviously tell when you have a party era when one party is consistently much more successful than the other. Or than the others, if you go back to the period before the Civil War, where there was a little bit more volatility and variety in the parties. Okay, but a party era, it's just an historical period where most people identify, most voters identify with one party consistently at the national level, electing its candidates. And of course, that would be both the presidency and Congress. Okay, you would want to see them in both places. Okay, we'll talk about that in a second. Why that's important. Most recent party era, 1932 to 1968, the Democrats won large majorities most of the time in Congress, and almost all of the presidents were for Democrats, except for Dwight Eisenhower, moderate Republican, very popular former general, obviously. So that would be a good example of a party era, somewhat recently, okay? A critical election basically marks the transition or marks the end of a party era, okay? So it's a time when, remember these massive parties, okay? We have two major parties in the American political system, but they are coalitions. There are lots of smaller groups, interests, they can be regional groups, all sorts of smaller constituent parts of the coalition that forms that party and votes for it consistently, okay? So a critical election basically is when that coalition really starts to break up and you see massive parts of the coalition shifting. Again, let's just talk about the two-party system since the Civil War, shifting from one party to the other, okay? It may take several elections to realize what's happening, right? In the moment, it might seem like it was just a fluke, a weird thing about a third-party candidate or a particular candidate that appealed to this group or that. But over time, you can look back and say, yeah, that was really kind of the turning point. Again, you might look at the 1968 election when Richard Nixon, a Republican, was elected as the end of that Democratic Party era. At the time, you might have thought, well, it's a odd thing that happened with all this chaos, all this controversy in the Democratic Party over the Vietnam War. Hubert Humphrey's the nominee. You had a pro-segregation segment of the Democratic Party breaking off. You might have thought that was temporary and things would go back to normal, but they did not. That signaled a permanent shift of those southern states shifting to the Republican Party from the Democratic Party to what they've been a very reliable part of the Democratic Party's coalition since the Civil War. They finally shifted over to the Republicans over civil rights and the end of segregation, and the fact that the Democratic Party, there were many Republicans who supported that as well, but the Democratic Party, some of their highest profile people were the ones who really made it happen. Kennedy's, Lyndon Johnson. So that, at the moment, you may not have realized this is the end of a party era. This is the end of a massive consensus. Remember, we talked about how in 1964, twice as many Americans, twice as many voters identified as Democrats as Republicans. And you might have thought even 4 years later, well, that's not going to end. This is not the end of that. This is just a weird one-off thing. And in 4 years or 8 years, things will go back to normal. But it did not. Republicans had a lot of success, at least in winning the presidency. Okay. So basically, a critical election is when you see those coalitions really start to break up. Okay. And it marks the end of a party era. And again, you may not be able to recognize it until you're looking in retrospect. Those new coalitions form, again, they can take several years, several election cycles, maybe even a few presidential election cycles to really cement and to really become, this is the new coalition. This is the way that things are now, okay? Your textbook talks about the history of political parties, has a good, this table here is from that, has a good overview of the history of political parties, okay? A lot of interesting stuff here. We can't talk about all of it. Two kind of major patterns. One, you see new people being brought into the electorate, right? New people being granted the right to vote or immigrating and becoming part of the electorate that way. But early on, the first push was to make it so that more than just the landed elites could vote, right? More than just the fairly wealthy elites who own actual property. The first kind of big movement, the first kind of big democratic movement in the expansion of the franchise, the voting franchise, the expansion of the electorate was just to let all white men vote, okay? And that kind of happened early on, and that was pushed for by the Democrats. Andrew Jackson, someone who was often associated with that, you know, and sort of a big populist in a lot of ways, right? And so you can see that the first party system, the Federalist kind of urban elites versus the Democratic Republicans, more and more of the anti-federalists, right? And you see that kind of that populist strain that was there with the Democratic Republicans get picked up by the Democrats. And you can see there's some overlap. It's not exact, but there's some overlap between the coalition that formed the real base of support for the Democratic Republicans and the coalition that formed the real base of support for the Democrats, okay? And then so that's kind of also the beginning of kind of a populist moment and success for the populist moment. It's also, as your textbook points out, around that time was when the Democrats started to turn into a party that, first of all, on the one hand, they created a more kind of personal politics and focused on individual candidates and kind of trying to forge a relationship between the voters and the candidates, somewhat emotional, somewhat an identification, a sort of really liking this as an individual. Former generals were popular for that. On the other hand, they also expanded and started to have a whole set of positions, of policy positions, which helped them build a larger coalition, okay? So rather than just trying to coordinate elites or maybe focus on a few narrow things that might motivate people in this one election, or might motivate the relatively limited number of people who could vote in this one election, they started to put out a whole set of kind of national policy priorities, which again was about building a larger coalition because more people could vote now, and kind of building that large national coalition. And they basically, you know, there was a party era there of about 30 years leading up to the Civil War, which was a fairly strong Democratic Party era, okay? After the Civil War, the Republicans did very well. And that's, of course, the other major point. So you see the expansion of the franchise to different people, the entry of new groups into the franchise, and then the importance of race and the legacy of the Civil War and slavery in particular, okay? So Republicans dominate after the Civil War, at least control the presidency. Of course, as we know, you have the resegregation, the movement to kind of stop African Americans. Again, it's only men at this point from voting. And so, you know, the fourth party system, Republicans still doing relatively well, okay? But you have a kind of a rise of third parties here. Your textbook talks about that some. They're relatively successful, not necessarily in winning the presidency, but they are successful in pushing certain policy and even things like constitutional amendments, okay? So these organizations, which sometimes took the form of third parties, other times were just groups of people organizing, they did have a lot of influence over the policy, and again, ultimately even the Constitution, even if they never won the populist and the progressive parties, the Bull Moose Party and so on, never won an actual presidential election, they still were significant and influential on really important policy decisions, and again, even the successful adoption of constitutional amendments, okay? Fifth party system, we just talked about this, okay? So basically beginning in the, Hoover was president for several years during the beginning of the Great Depression. It didn't go away. Roosevelt takes over, okay? And this is a clear party era for the Democrats. This dates it to 1964. You could also date it to 1968. Okay, African Americans begin to move towards the Democratic Party. They start to push civil rights, and that ultimately leads to the destruction of that coalition, okay? Democrats control the presidency, as your table says here. It's not just the presidency, though. They also do really well in congressional elections. This focuses a lot on the presidency. That's not the only thing to look at, right? Especially in the 19th century, where Congress had a lot of power, probably more power consistently through the 19th century than Congress has had, say, since World War II. So it's not just a question of how many people or how many members of a party are being elected to the presidency. That party era from the 1930s to the 1960s, strong Democratic Party era. They have a lot of success in congressional elections. All of the presidents are Democrats except for Eisenhower, again, popular former general, moderate Republican. So there is that, but then again, it starts to break up. And since then, what we have is not necessarily consistency, okay? First of all, well, we'll talk about this in a second. So there's, well, so we call it party realignment is when a group moves from one party to the next, right? So you might say that this particular group, this particular part of a party's coalition realigns with the other party, or you might say the majority, there's party realignment in that we move from a Republican Party era to a Democratic Party era, okay? But what we've seen instead is, again, if you go back to that 1968 election, since then, since Nixon was sworn in 1969 up until 2020, Congress and the presidency have been controlled by the same party for only about 13 of those 51 years. Okay, now I guess with Kamala Harris being the tiebreaker, you could say that the Democrats control Congress as well as the presidency, but you know, it's really a tie in the Senate. So I'm not entirely sure how to count this one, but we won't worry about that. You see, what happens is you do have the end of the Democratic success at the presidential level. Nixon, of course, Ford takes over when he resigns. Then Carter wins, but this is obviously a backlash and a reaction to Watergate, okay? Reagan wins, Reagan is reelected, George H.W. Bush wins, Bill Clinton gets elected for various reasons that we could talk about, but you know, he governs during very successful economy. He has a very successful economy. He governs during very happy times. And then George W. Bush is elected, and then you know he's reelected, and then Obama is elected and reelected. So it, you know, if we stretch it all the way to now, then Trump, then Biden, it does start to look like a lot of variety in the presidency. But one consistency here, Congress has also been moving much more in the 21st century. Okay, so the Democrats generally had a majority in Congress, especially in the House, up until 1994. The Republicans win a big majority. It's kind of a turning point. 12 years later, in 2006, you have a Republican president. The Democrats win control of Congress. A Democrat is elected president in 2008. 2010, Republicans take control of Congress back. 2016, Donald Trump is elected. 2018, Democrats take control of the House back, okay? So what you kind of have is an era of what sometimes people call party de-alignment, when the electorate as a whole, the majority of voters really don't seem to identify with either party and to elect its candidates consistently. Again, you can see it at the presidential level, maybe even more you can see it at how Americans are consistently voting for divided government. One party in the presidency, one party controlling Congress, okay? And sometimes that can work relatively well. You know, Reagan and the Democratic Congress maybe being a good example. But oftentimes, especially again, as things have become more partisan and people have become more unyielding, it can kind of do the opposite. It can create gridlock, and you can have a system where one person comes in and they almost want to undo whatever the previous president has done, because you know, again, you have this sort of gridlock and partisanship and polarization. Okay, so this era of party de-alignment, you see it in different ways. No clear, consistent success for either party. Maybe even more, the fact that Americans are consistently voting for divided government. Okay, where one party controls the presidency, the other party controls Congress. If that is, you know, if there's a big landslide like in 2008, and Barack Obama is elected by, you know, a landslide, and the Democrats do really well in congressional elections, that only lasts for 2 years, okay? So this era of party de-alignment where there isn't any consistent success for either party seems to be what we're living through. And it's, you know, again, it can make it difficult for Congress or for government to do anything consistently and successfully. So it, you know, may not be the best system, and I guess we'll see how much longer it lasts.